It was that summer of 1982 when everything changed forever, though at the time I didn't know I was living through the last normal days of my life. I was only 10 years old when my parents, Sarah and Michael Bennett, decided we needed a family vacation away from the city, away from the noise, away from everything that connected us to the civilized world. My sister Emma was 8 and was going through her phase of collecting colorful stones, always with her pockets full of small treasures she found along the way. To this day, I hear the little rattling sound of stones in her pocket when she ran through the house, a sound that became the most painful echo in my memory. Montana was the chosen destination, not by chance, but because my father had a silent obsession with topographical maps and unexplored trails. He would spend hours hunched over those detailed maps, tracing routes with his index finger, as if he were drawing our future, marking points of interest with small red circles that looked like drops of blood on the yellowed paper. Mom always said he was born with a compass in his heart, always pointing toward places where others didn't have the courage to go. "Your father wants to take us to the end of the world," she would murmur while packing our bags. But there was affection in that complaint, a loving acceptance that we would follow Michael Bennett wherever he wanted to lead us. The cabin we rented was 3 hours by car from the nearest town, a dark wood construction nestled among centennial pine trees that looked like silent soldiers guarding ancient secrets. The smell of resin and damp wood enveloped me the moment I stepped out of the car, an aroma so intense it seemed to have its own substance, sticking to skin and clothes like an invisible mark. To this day, when I pass by a hardware store and smell cut wood, my heart races and my hands begin to tremble involuntarily, as if my body remembers something my mind tries to forget. Emma immediately ran to the wooden porch, her steps echoing like small drums, and began separating the stones she had collected during the trip. She organized them by color and size with the seriousness of a miniature scientist, creating small, colorful towers that gleamed under the golden light of late afternoon. "I'm going to make a stone castle," she announced, with that absolute conviction only children possess. "And we'll live here forever." Dad laughed with that deep laugh that made my chest vibrate with happiness, and Mom ran her hand through Emma's blonde hair with a tenderness that seemed capable of healing any wound in the world. Nobody wanted to talk about it, but there was something different about that place from the first day. It wasn't anything obvious or frightening at first sight, just a subtle feeling that we were being watched by invisible eyes hidden among the trees. The birds seemed to sing in lower tones, almost whispers, and the wind carried sounds we couldn't completely identify. Mom commented on the second night that she had the impression someone had reorganized her things in her suitcase, though nothing was missing. Dad attributed this to travel fatigue, but I noticed how his eyes began making small sweeps around the corners of the cabin, as if searching for something that shouldn't be there. The nights were particularly intense. The silence had layers. First, the obvious silence of the absence of cars and human voices, then a deeper silence that seemed to absorb even the natural sounds of the forest. Emma began having trouble sleeping on the third night, claiming she heard whispers in the attic. When we went up to check, we found nothing but spider webs and old boxes covered in dust, but the smell up there was different from the rest of the house, sweeter, almost nauseating, like wilted flowers mixed with something we couldn't name. To this day, I hear her name being called in that attic. It was always in the middle of the night, a low and indistinct voice that seemed to come from within the wooden boards themselves. "Emma, Emma." The sound was so faint we would doubt if we had really heard it, but Emma always woke up when this happened, sitting up in bed with wide eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if she could see through the wood. "Someone is calling me," she would say with a certainty that chilled our blood. "Someone up there wants to play with me." But I remember the smell. I always come back to the smell. It was as if the cabin itself was exhaling memories of other families who had passed through there, other children who might have heard the same whispers in the attic, other parents who might have felt the same growing uneasiness I saw in Dad's eyes with each passing day. The smell intensified during the night, especially in the bedrooms, a mixture of old wood, dampness, and something organic decomposing that seemed to come from within the walls. It was on the 5th night that Dad decided he needed to map the area around the cabin. He had brought his orientation equipment, compass, altimeter, primitive GPS, and of course that detailed topographical map he studied religiously every morning while drinking coffee. "I want to better understand where we are," he explained to Mom while preparing his hiking backpack. I want to know what kind of terrain surrounds us." There was an urgency in his voice that hadn't existed in the first days, as if he had noticed something in the maps he hadn't seen before. Emma insisted on accompanying him on the morning exploration. She had filled her pockets with her favorite stones, saying she wanted to mark the path like Hansel and Gretel, an innocent reference that now makes my skin crawl. Mom hesitated, but Dad said it would just be a short walk to map the nearest trails, that they would be back before lunch. "We're going to make a map of our secret kingdom," he told Emma, who clapped with joy at the prospect of becoming an official explorer. They left around 9 in the morning, when the mountain mist was still clinging to the treetops like ghostly fingers reluctant to let go of the night. I watched from the cabin window as they disappeared between the pines, Emma's bright yellow jacket becoming a small dot of sunshine that gradually faded into the green darkness of the forest. Dad had that determined walk he always had when he was following a map, confident steps that suggested he knew exactly where he was going, though I wonder now if he really did. Mom and I spent the morning reading on the porch, she with one of her romance novels and I with a comic book about superheroes who always knew how to find their way home. The morning passed peacefully, with only the sound of pages turning and the distant call of birds echoing through the valley. Around 11, Mom started glancing at her watch more frequently, and by noon she was standing at the porch railing, shading her eyes with her hand as she scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. "They should be back by now," she said, more to herself than to me, but I heard the thin thread of worry beginning to weave through her voice. By 1 o'clock, that thread had become a rope. By 2, it was a chain. Mom tried calling out their names, her voice echoing off the mountains and returning to us empty, like a question that refused to be answered. The forest seemed to swallow her calls, absorbing them into its green depths without even the courtesy of an echo. I remember the exact moment when worry transformed into fear. It was around 3 in the afternoon, when Mom found Dad's compass on the ground just 20 yards into the forest, gleaming in a shaft of sunlight that somehow made it look like evidence of something terrible. Dad never dropped his compass. Never. It was like an extension of his hand, something he checked constantly, automatically the way other people check their pulse. Finding it abandoned on the pine needle carpet was like finding his severed finger. "Michael!" Mum screamed then, her voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. "Emma, where are you?" The sound she made wasn't quite human anymore, more like a wounded animal calling for its young. I wanted to help her search, but she made me stay at the cabin in case they come back, though we both knew they weren't coming back the way they had left. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened next, how the hours stretched into an elastic nightmare where time seemed to move both too fast and too slow. Mom called the local sheriff around 5 o'clock from the cabin's old rotary phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to dial the number 3 times. I can still hear the mechanical clicking of that phone, a sound like bones breaking in the gathering dusk. The sheriff was a man named Bill Garrett, with a voice like gravel, and the kind of measured patience that comes from years of dealing with tourists who get lost in the mountains. But I remember the smell that night, how it changed after Dad and Emma disappeared. The sweet, sickly odor from the attic seemed to seep down through the entire cabin, mixing with the pine scent until it became something else entirely, something that made my stomach churn, and my skin feel like it was crawling with invisible insects. Mom noticed it too. I caught her sniffing the air with a puzzled, disgusted expression, opening windows that had been closed for days, as if she could somehow air out whatever wrongness had settled into the wooden bones of the place. The search began the next morning with a team of 6 men and 2 bloodhounds, German shepherds named Rex and Scout, who circled the cabin with their noses to the ground, tails rigid with concentration. Sheriff Garrett explained that most people who get lost in these mountains are found within 24 hours, usually dehydrated and scared, but otherwise unharmed. "The forest has a way of turning people around," he said, squinting at Dad's topographical map with the red circles, marking points of interest. "But it usually gives them back. Usually." That word hung in the mountain air like smoke from a fire we couldn't see. They found Emma's first stone marker about half a mile into the forest, a perfect circle of colorful pebbles arranged with the precision only an 8-year-old would consider necessary. The stones were arranged in a pattern that made sense only to her. Blues and greens on the outside, reds and yellows in the center, like a flower made of mineral petals. Sheriff Garrett photographed it from several angles, treating those children's stones with the seriousness of evidence in a court case. To this day, I hear Emma's voice explaining her system. The blue ones are for sky, the green ones are for trees, the red ones are for love, and the yellow ones are for finding your way home. She had told me this on the second day of our vacation, while organizing her collection on the porch, not knowing she was describing a code we would never fully understand. They found the second marker another quarter-mile deeper, but this one was different. The stones were scattered in a wide circle as if they had been dropped in haste or knocked from small hands by branches or something worse. Some were pressed into the soft earth, as if someone had stepped on them, though the search team couldn't determine if the footprints belonged to Emma, Dad, or someone else entirely. The tracks around the scattered stones were confused, overlapping, going in multiple directions like a conversation written in mud and dried leaves. But I remember the smell from the search dogs. Even they seemed affected by whatever wrongness hung in the air of that forest. Rex, the larger of the two German shepherds, kept whining and pawing at his nose as if trying to clear away a scent that disturbed him. Scout refused to follow the trail beyond the second stone marker, sitting down heavily and looking back toward the cabin with eyes that seemed almost human in their worry. "Never seen them act like this," their handler muttered, checking the dogs for injuries, finding nothing wrong except a reluctance to continue that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. The third day brought more searchers, including a helicopter that circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, its rotors chopping the air into fragments that scattered the birds and made conversation impossible. From the cabin porch, I watched it disappear and reappear between the mountain peaks, following search patterns that looked random from below, but followed a logic I couldn't grasp. Mom stood beside me, her hand gripping the porch railing so tightly her knuckles had turned white as Emma's scattered stones. "They'll find them," she kept saying, a mantra that became less convincing each time she repeated it. "They have to find them. People don't just disappear." But her voice had acquired a hollow quality, as if she was speaking to convince herself rather than reassure me. The mountains around us seemed to absorb her words the way they had absorbed her earlier calls, swallowing them into green silence that offered no comfort. Nobody wanted to talk about the things they found on the fourth day. Sheriff Garrett came to the cabin around sunset with evidence bags containing items that made my mother's face go pale as milk. Dad's watch, found tangled in a bramble bush nearly 2 miles from his last known position. 3 more of Emma's stones, but these were different. They had been arranged in a straight line pointing deeper into the forest, toward an area the maps marked as impassable terrain, with symbols that meant cliffs and dangerous drops. The watch bothered everyone because it was still running, keeping perfect time as if Dad had just taken it off moments before they found it. Sheriff Garrett wound it carefully, noting the time in his notebook with the precision of someone who has learned not to overlook any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. "Could mean they passed this way recently," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe his own words. "Until today I hear the tick of that watch in my dreams. It had a distinctive sound, slightly irregular, like a heartbeat with an occasional skip." Dad had inherited it from his father, who had carried it through the Second World War, and it had developed its unique rhythm over decades of faithful service. Finding it still ticking in that forsaken bramble seemed like a message from beyond, though none of us could decipher what it was trying to say. The search expanded on the 5th day to include areas the original teams had deemed too dangerous for civilian hikers. These were regions of loose scree and hidden ravines, places where a wrong step could send someone tumbling hundreds of feet down rocky slopes, invisible from above. The searchers worked with ropes and climbing equipment, calling down into chasms that swallowed their voices without returning even an echo. But I remember the smell of those evidence bags when Sheriff Garrett opened them in our kitchen. Each item carried the forest scent, but underneath was something else, something sweet and wrong, that made me think of the attic smell intensified 100-fold. Mom noticed it too. She stepped back from the table as if the smell was something physical she needed to avoid, covering her nose with her hand and breathing through her mouth. By the 6th day, the official search was scaled back. Sheriff Garrett explained this was normal procedure, that they had to allocate resources to other emergencies, but he assured us the case would remain open indefinitely. "We don't give up on people," he said, though I noticed he avoided looking directly at Mom when he said it. The helicopter made one final pass, circling wider than before, checking areas that seemed more like wishful thinking than logical search zones. The bloodhounds made their last attempt that afternoon, but their behavior had become increasingly erratic. Rex would start following a trail enthusiastically, then suddenly stop and whine as if he had encountered an invisible wall. Scout refused to enter the forest at all, preferring to sit in the cabin's shadow and watch the tree line with the alertness of a guard dog who had spotted intruders no human could see. Nobody wanted to talk about leaving, but by the 7th day it became clear we couldn't stay indefinitely. Mom had to return to work, I had to go back to school, and the cabin rental was nearly expired. The owner, a man named Peterson who lived in town, had driven out to check on us and mentioned that other guests were scheduled to arrive the following week. He was kind about the situation, offering to extend our stay free of charge if we needed more time, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely surprised by what had happened. "Strange things in these mountains," Peterson said quietly while Mom was inside packing, speaking to me as if I were adult enough to understand. "Always have been. Indians used to avoid this area entirely, called it a place where the earth dreams hungry dreams." He glanced toward the forest edge, then back at me. "Your family ain't the first to have troubles here, son. Won't be the last either. But I remember the smell of my father's aftershave lingering in the cabin bathroom, how it mixed with the pine scent and the wrongness from the attic to create an olfactory memory so powerful it still stops me in my tracks 30 years later." Mom found his shaving kit on the sink counter, untouched since the morning they disappeared, and she held it against her chest like a religious artifact, while tears ran down her cheeks in silent rivers. The drive home was a journey through landscapes that should have been beautiful, but felt like a retreat from a battle we had lost, without understanding how or why. Mom drove with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from shock, checking the mirrors constantly, as if she expected to see Dad's car following us, as if this had all been some elaborate family joke that would be revealed at the last moment. I sat in the passenger seat, watching Montana disappear behind us, carrying the terrible knowledge that we were abandoning them somehow. School resumed 2 weeks later, but I found it impossible to concentrate on anything that seemed to matter. Other kids knew something had happened to my family, but the details had been kept from them, creating a bubble of awkward silence that followed me through hallways and classrooms. Teachers spoke to me with the careful gentleness reserved for broken things, offering extensions on assignments and understanding about missed homework, as if academic success could somehow compensate for the absence of half my family. To this day, I hear Emma's laugh echoing in unexpected moments. It would bubble up from the lunchroom noise or hide behind the sound of other children playing at recess, just familiar enough to make me turn my head and search for her bright yellow jacket among the crowd. But she was never there, of course. She was still somewhere in those Montana mountains, along with Dad and his maps and his compass that had been found gleaming in the sunlight like a breadcrumb in a fairy tale with no ending. The investigation continued sporadically over the following months. Sheriff Garrett would call every few weeks, with updates that weren't really updates, reports of expanded search areas that yielded nothing but more questions. A team of experts in missing persons cases reviewed the evidence, interviewed Mom and me separately, constructed psychological profiles and probability charts that reduced my family to statistics and hypotheses. But I remember the smell of the manila folders full of police reports, how they carried the scent of institutional coffee and cigarette smoke, and the peculiar mustiness of government buildings where people processed tragedy into paperwork. Mom would spread these documents across our dining room table, reading them with the desperate intensity of someone studying scripture, searching for clues the professionals might have missed. One report mentioned that the area around our cabin had an unusually high number of missing persons cases dating back to the 1940s. Hikers, hunters, a family of campers in 1967, 2 teenagers in 1975, a wildlife photographer in 1979. All had vanished without a trace in roughly the same region, within a few miles of the dark wood cabin that had been our home for 7 days in the summer of 1982. The patterns were subtle, but consistent. Most disappearances occurred during the summer months. Many involved families with children. In almost every case, personal items were found scattered along trails leading deeper into the wilderness, arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. The forest seemed to be collecting souvenirs. Nobody wanted to talk about the local legends, but they existed in whispers and half-remembered stories. Peterson, the cabin owner, had mentioned hungry dreams, but there were other tales that surfaced during the investigation. Stories about the mountains being hollow, honeycombed with caves that connected to underground systems no one had ever mapped completely. Stories about sounds that carried further than they should, voices that called in the dark with words that weren't quite human. The local newspaper, a weekly publication called the Mountain Echo, had archived references to what they called the vanishing zone, always written with the kind of careful skepticism that newspapers use when reporting things that don't fit into rational frameworks. But the facts remained. Too many people had disappeared in too small an area for statistical comfort, and none of them had ever been found. Until today, I hear the sound of our phone ringing at 3 in the morning during those months after we returned home. Mom would stumble from her bedroom, hoping each call might be news, might be them calling from some hospital or police station, might be the miracle that would restore our family. But it was always hang-ups, always silence on the other end, that lasted just long enough to raise hope before dissolving into dial tone. The calls stopped after about 6 months, but by then Mum had developed insomnia that she never quite conquered. I would find her sitting at the kitchen table at 2 or 3 in the morning, staring at Dad's maps under the overhead light, tracing routes with her finger the way he used to do. She had gotten his topographical collection from the cabin, along with his other equipment, and she studied them with an obsession that worried me. "There's something here," she would say, when she caught me watching her from the doorway, pointing to areas she had circled in different-colored ink. Something he saw that made him want to explore further. Some pattern in the terrain that drew him deeper. Her finger would follow elevation lines and trail markers with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. But I remember the smell of her midnight coffee, how it mixed with the paper scent of the maps to create an atmosphere of desperate research that permeated our house for years. She was trying to map their disappearance, to chart their path into oblivion with the same precision Dad had used to plan family vacations. But maps can only show what cartographers have seen and measured, and some territories remain unmapped because they refuse to hold still long enough to be captured on paper. School counselors suggested therapy, and Mum dutifully took me to appointments with a woman named Dr. Patricia Hodges, who had an office that smelled like vanilla candles and spoke in tones so gentle they made my teeth ache. Dr. Hodges specialized in childhood trauma and wanted me to talk about my feelings, to process my grief through activities like drawing pictures and playing with toys designed to encourage emotional expression. I drew pictures of the cabin over and over, always from the same angle, the view from the porch looking toward the forest where they had disappeared. My drawings never varied much: the dark wood structure, the pine trees like spear points against the sky, the space between the trees where Dad and Emma had vanished. Dr. Hodges would study these drawings as if they contained hidden messages, asking about my choice of colors, the placement of objects, the absence of people in scenes that should have included my family. To this day, I hear Dr. Hodges asking, "Where do you think they went, David? What do you imagine happened to them?" As if imagination could somehow solve what investigation had failed to uncover. I never told her about the smell from the attic, or the whispers Emma claimed to hear, or the way the forest seemed to swallow sounds without returning echoes. Some experiences are too strange to share with people who carry clipboards and take notes. The second year was worse than the first because the shock had worn off, leaving only the vast absence where Dad and Emma used to be. Mum tried to maintain normal routines, family dinners for 2, Christmas presents under a tree that seemed too large for our reduced family, birthday celebrations that felt like performances for an audience that wasn't coming. We were learning to live around the hole they had left, the way cities build around ruins that are too important to demolish, but too damaged to restore. I started having dreams about the cabin during that second year, dreams so vivid, I would wake up convinced I could smell pine resin and hear Emma's stones rattling in her pockets. In these dreams, I was always alone in the cabin, wandering from room to room looking for them, calling their names into rooms that echoed back nothing but silence. The attic in my dreams was different, larger, extending further back into darkness that seemed to have no boundaries. But I remember the smell in those dream cabins, how it was always the same sweet wrongness I had noticed during our last days there, but intensified to the point where it became almost visible, hanging in the air like fog made of something other than water. The smell would follow me out of sleep, lingering in my bedroom for minutes after I opened my eyes, as if part of the dream cabin had followed me home. Mum started planning return trips during the third year, obsessive expeditions back to Montana that she mapped with the same precision Dad had used for our original vacation. She contacted hiking guides, mountain rescue specialists, even a few individuals who specialized in what they carefully called unusual disappearances. Most of them were kind but realistic about the chances of finding anything after so much time had passed. Sheriff Garrett, now approaching retirement, remained supportive, but had clearly moved the case into the category of unsolved mysteries that sometimes surface in retirement years but rarely find resolution. He still took Mum's calls and answered her questions with patience, but there was a quality in his voice that suggested he had seen enough missing persons cases to understand which ones would be solved and which ones would join the mountain legends. Nobody wanted to talk about the search Mum conducted during the summer of 1985, 3 years after they disappeared. She hired a guide named Marcus Chen, a former park ranger who had left official service after disagreements with policy regarding unsolved disappearances in wilderness areas. Chen had theories about the vanishing zone that went beyond conventional search methodology, ideas about underground waterways and hidden cave systems that might explain how people could disappear so completely. The search lasted 5 days and covered areas no previous teams had explored. Regions Chen identified using thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar he had acquired through private channels. They found items that might have belonged to other missing persons, a child sneaker from the 1970s, camping equipment that didn't match any official missing persons reports, personal effects that seemed to have been arranged rather than lost randomly. But I remember the smell Mum carried when she returned from that expedition, how it clung to her clothes and hair like the cabin attic scent concentrated into something almost toxic. She showered twice the first night back, but couldn't seem to wash it away completely, and for weeks afterward I would catch traces of it when she passed through rooms, a sweet corruption that made me think of flowers growing in poisoned soil. Chen had refused to discuss the details of what they found, citing professional discretion and respect for ongoing investigations, but Mom came home with the expression I had never seen before. Not grief or hope or desperation, but a kind of terrible knowledge that she couldn't or wouldn't share. When I asked about the trip, she would only say, "Some places aren't meant to give up their secrets, David. Some mysteries are warnings." The 4th year brought changes that felt like accepting defeat without formally surrendering. Mom sold Dad's car, a blue station wagon that had been gathering dust in our garage like a monument to interrupted journeys. She donated his clothes to charity, keeping only a few items that carried his scent: his favorite sweater, the jacket he wore for outdoor work, the hat he had been wearing in the last photograph we took of him before they disappeared into the forest. School had become easier by then, not because I had healed, but because I had learned to function around the wound. Teachers stopped treating me with special gentleness, classmates stopped asking questions, and I developed the skill of appearing normal while carrying knowledge that separated me from other teenagers who worried about grades and sports and social dynamics that seemed impossibly trivial. To this day, I hear other families planning vacations and feel a chill that has nothing to do with weather. The casual way people discuss mountain cabins and forest getaways, the excitement in children's voices when they talk about exploring the wilderness, the confidence parents display when they plan adventures in places where cell phones don't work and help is hours away. All of it reminds me that most people live in a world where families return from vacations intact. I graduated high school in 1990, 8 years after the disappearance, and decided to study cartography in college. The choice seemed obvious to everyone who knew our family history. The son of a man obsessed with maps becoming a professional map maker felt like honoring his memory or finishing his work. But my real motivation was different. I wanted to understand what Dad had seen in those topographical charts, what patterns had drawn him deeper into the forest than safety allowed. Cartography school taught me that maps are always incomplete, that they represent not reality, but selected aspects of reality chosen by the mapmaker for specific purposes. Elevation lines show the shape of land, but not the quality of soil. Trail markers indicate paths, but not their difficulty or danger. Topographical maps display the skeleton of landscape, but not its flesh, its personality, its moods and hungers. But I remember the smell of map ink and paper, how it became a comfort that reminded me of Dad, without triggering the sharp pain that other memories carried. Working with charts and surveys felt like maintaining a conversation with him across time and distance. Using the language of coordinates and compass bearings he had taught me during our earlier, safer family trips. My college thesis focused on missing persons patterns in wilderness areas, specifically the statistical clustering that occurs in certain geographical regions. I mapped disappearances across the American West, looking for correlations between terrain features and vanishing patterns. The data revealed anomalies that conventional search methodology couldn't explain, pockets of landscape that seemed to attract disappearances the way magnetic fields attract metal filings. The Montana region where my family had vanished showed up as a red-hot spot on my statistical maps, a concentration of missing persons cases that defied probability. But when I presented my findings to professors and wilderness safety experts, they attributed the clustering to confirmation bias, arguing that I was seeing patterns because I wanted them to exist, that grief was distorting my analytical objectivity. Nobody wanted to talk about the implications of what I had discovered, the possibility that certain landscapes might be actively dangerous in ways that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of natural hazards. Academic discourse requires evidence that can be replicated and verified, and my maps showed correlations without providing mechanisms, patterns without processes. I graduated in 1994 and took a job with the U.S. Geological Survey, working on boundary surveys and trail mapping projects that took me throughout the western states. The work was satisfying in ways that had nothing to do with career advancement. I was creating documents that might help future families navigate safely through terrain that had swallowed mine, adding detail and accuracy to maps that could mean the difference between returning home and joining the statistics. Until today, I hear Dad's voice explaining how to read contour lines, how to identify safe camping spots, how to recognize terrain features that indicate reliable water sources or potential hazards. His lessons had saved my life dozens of times during solo expeditions into areas where mistakes would have consequences no rescue team could address. I carried his knowledge like a protective charm, an inheritance more valuable than money or property. The 15th anniversary of their disappearance occurred during the summer of 1997, while I was working on a survey project in Wyoming. Mom called me at the field station to mark the date, and we spent an hour on the satellite phone remembering details we had shared countless times before. But the conversation felt different somehow, more like a ritual than a genuine attempt to process grief. We had become curators of their memory, preserving it through repetition the way museums preserve artifacts through careful display. Mom had aged in ways that went beyond time, developing the kind of weathered fragility that comes from carrying too much sadness for too many years. She still lived in our family house, still studied Dad's maps occasionally, but the obsessive intensity of the early years had settled into a quieter form of remembrance. She gardened now, growing flowers that attracted butterflies, as if she were trying to populate the world with small, beautiful things to compensate for what had been taken away. But I remember the smell of her garden, how certain flowers, particularly the white ones, carried fragrances that reminded me of the cabin attic, sweet scents with undertones that made me uneasy without logical reason. I never told her about these associations, didn't want to contaminate her small pleasures with memories that served no constructive purpose. My work with the Geological Survey occasionally took me through Montana, though I avoided the specific region where our cabin had been located. I told myself this was professional efficiency, that there were other areas requiring attention, but the truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to face that landscape again, wasn't prepared for whatever emotions or memories might surface if I returned to the place where my family had been edited out of existence. Other surveyors who worked the Montana mountains sometimes mentioned the area in casual conversation, referring to it as a region where equipment malfunctioned frequently and search teams reported unusual difficulties with radio communication. These were practical problems with practical implications, the kinds of challenges that required backup plans and extra safety precautions, but they created an informal understanding that certain areas demanded more respect than others. To this day, I hear static on radio communications when I'm working in areas that share certain topographical features with our old vacation spot. It's probably atmospheric interference or equipment aging, but the sound always makes me think of voices trying to communicate across distances that can't be measured in miles or kilometers, signals that originate from coordinates that don't appear on any map. The 20-year anniversary in 2002 passed without ceremony. Mom and I had learned to let these dates flow by like water around stones, acknowledging them without drowning in them. I was working in Colorado by then, mapping wilderness areas for hiking guides and safety publications, work that felt like a form of prayer, creating documents that might prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured. I had married a woman named Lisa, a nurse who specialized in trauma recovery, and we had built a life that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. She knew about Dad and Emma, of course, but she also understood that some stories need to be carried privately, that sharing every detail of pain doesn't always reduce its weight. We had our own rituals and routines, our own small happinesses that existed independently of tragedy. But I remember the smell of Lisa's hospital uniforms, how the medical scents of antiseptic and starched fabric reminded me that healing happens gradually, that people learn to live with wounds that never completely close. She would come home from shifts where she had treated car accident victims and domestic violence survivors and children with illnesses that had no names, and she carried their stories the way I carried mine, carefully, respectfully, without letting them define everything else about existence. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came during the summer of 2008, 26 years after the disappearance. I was working on a survey project in northern Montana, mapping trail systems for a new wilderness preserve, when a local sheriff contacted me about an unusual discovery. A hiker had found what appeared to be a piece of surveying equipment in a remote canyon, gear that matched the description of items my father had been carrying when he disappeared. Sheriff Patricia Williams, who had replaced the retired Bill Garrett, drove me to the site on a Tuesday morning that began with fog so thick it seemed solid, something you could walk on if you knew the technique. The canyon was about 8 miles from our original cabin location, accessible only through terrain that would have required serious mountaineering skills to navigate safely. The equipment was wedged between rocks at the bottom of a narrow ravine, protected from weather by an overhang that had created a natural shelter. Nobody wanted to talk about how a piece of Dad's surveying gear could have traveled 8 miles through difficult terrain and ended up in a location that couldn't be reached through accidental wandering. The canyon required deliberate navigation, specialized equipment, and knowledge of climbing techniques that Dad didn't possess. Yet there it was, his backup compass, engraved with his initials, still functional after more than 2 decades of exposure to mountain weather. The discovery prompted a new search effort, smaller than the original but more focused, concentrating on the canyon system and surrounding areas that previous teams had deemed inaccessible. I took leave from my regular work to participate, bringing my own surveying experience and intimate knowledge of Dad's methods and preferences. For the first time in 26 years, I was actively looking for them instead of simply carrying their memory. But I remember the smell of that canyon, how it seemed familiar despite being unlike any landscape I had encountered before. The air carried scents that reminded me of the cabin attic, but mixed with mineral odors from deep underground, as if the canyon were exhaling breath from caves that extended further into the earth than light could penetrate. It was the smell of deep places, of geological time, of spaces where human presence registered as brief interruptions in conversations between stone and water. The search team included specialists in cave exploration, people who spent their professional lives mapping underground systems that existed parallel to the surface world. They found evidence of extensive caverns beneath the canyon, interconnected chambers that hadn't been fully documented by any previous geological survey. Water moved through these spaces in patterns that didn't match surface drainage, creating underground rivers that could transport objects or people across distances that defied surface geography. We spent 3 weeks exploring accessible portions of the cave system, working in teams that maintained constant radio contact and followed safety protocols developed for environments where a wrong turn could mean disappearing forever. The caves revealed evidence of human presence, not recent but not ancient either, items that might have belonged to missing persons from various decades, arranged in ways that suggested purpose rather than accident. To this day, I hear the echo of our voices bouncing off cave walls, how the sound seemed to travel further than physics should allow, carrying conversations into depths we couldn't explore without equipment we didn't have. The caves had their own acoustic signature, a resonance that made whispers sound like shouts, and made silence feel like a living presence watching from shadows we couldn't illuminate completely. One chamber, accessible only through a passage that required crawling for nearly 100 yards, contained what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement of personal items. Watches, jewelry, children's toys, hiking gear, camping equipment, objects that spanning decades of missing persons cases, organized according to some system we couldn't decipher. The items were preserved in the cave's constant temperature and humidity, protected from decay but not from the wrongness that seemed to permeate the underground spaces. The search team documented everything with forensic precision, but they stopped short of removing items without proper archaeological oversight. The cave chamber felt like a museum exhibit, but instead of celebrating human achievement, it memorialized human absence. Each object represented someone who had walked into the mountains and never walked out, families that had been reduced to evidence bags and statistical entries. But I remember the smell of those preserved objects, how they carried traces of the lives they had belonged to, scents that should have faded after years or decades underground, but somehow remained as fresh as if their owners had handled them yesterday. Emma's distinctive sweet scent was there, mixed with Dad's aftershave, both overlaid with something else that might have been the smell of deep earth, or something that lived in deep earth. We found Dad's main compass in that chamber, along with several of Emma's stones, arranged in the same pattern she had created on the cabin porch during our first day, blues and greens on the outside, reds and yellows in the center, like a flower made of mineral petals. But there were other stones mixed in, stones that didn't match the geology of the surface area, as if they had been brought from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that existed beneath the maps we used to navigate the known world. The expedition ended without finding their remains, but with evidence that they had somehow traveled from their surface disappearance point to an underground location that required knowledge and equipment they hadn't possessed. The cave discoveries raised more questions than they answered, creating new mysteries, while confirming that the original investigation had been working with incomplete information about the landscape they had been searching. Sheriff Williams filed a report that carefully documented the discoveries without speculating about their implications. She was a practical woman who dealt with evidence rather than theories, and the evidence suggested that missing persons in this region might be connected to underground systems that hadn't been adequately explored by previous search efforts. Her recommendations included cave mapping projects and specialized training for wilderness rescue teams. Nobody wanted to talk about the possibility that the cave arrangements had been created by something other than human agency, or that the preservation of personal items might be the result of processes that went beyond natural cave conditions. The objects were too carefully organized, too systematically preserved, too deliberately displayed to be the result of random cave-ins or underground flooding. But acknowledging this meant acknowledging possibilities that didn't fit into frameworks used by law enforcement or search and rescue organizations. I returned to my regular work, changed by what I had seen underground, carrying knowledge that affected how I read topographical maps and planned survey routes. Surface features told only part of any landscape story, and some regions required understanding of vertical geography that extended below the depths indicated by conventional elevation markers. I began noting discrepancies between surface drainage and underground water flow, areas where missing person statistics suggested hazards that didn't appear on standard trail maps. Until today, I hear the sound of water moving through rock, the underground rivers that carry secrets from depths no surveyor has measured completely. During quiet moments in the field, when I'm alone with my equipment in areas that remind me of our old Montana vacation spot, I sometimes detect underground sounds that make me think of voices calling from chambers I'll never see, conversations that began decades ago and continue in languages written in stone. Mom died peacefully in her sleep during the winter of 2012, 30 years after our family was broken. She had lived long enough to see the cave discoveries, to understand that Dad and Emma had somehow continued their journey beyond the point where surface searches could follow. I think this brought her a kind of comfort, knowing they hadn't simply vanished, but had traveled somewhere else, somewhere that explained why calling their names had never produced echoes that led home. Her funeral was attended by people who remembered our family before the disappearance, friends and neighbors who had watched us become a missing persons case study, a cautionary tale about wilderness safety, a reminder that some vacations end with empty bedrooms and questions that span decades. They offered condolences that acknowledged not just Mom's death, but the long grieving that had preceded it, the 30 years she had spent learning to live with absence. But I remember the smell of flowers at her service, how certain arrangements reminded me of the cave chamber's wrongness, mixed with the cabin attic's sweetness, fragrances that shouldn't have combined but somehow did, creating olfactory memories that connected past and present in ways that made my chest tight with something beyond simple sadness. Mom had chosen her burial flowers carefully, selecting varieties that carried meaning she hadn't shared, but that I recognized from her garden's careful plantings. I inherited the family house and Dad's collection of maps, documents that had guided his planning and Mum's obsessions, charts that revealed the enthusiasm and precision he had brought to family adventures that were supposed to create memories rather than mysteries. His notes in the margins showed his thought processes, the way he had identified points of interest, and planned routes that would provide scenic value without excessive danger. He had been a careful planner who had encountered something that couldn't be planned for. The maps became my responsibility, along with the box of police reports and search documentation that Mum had maintained for 3 decades. I was now the keeper of their story, the only person who remembered the sound of Emma's stones rattling in her pockets, the only witness to the progression from ordinary family vacation to statistical anomaly that confused everyone who tried to explain what had happened in rational terms. To this day, I hear sheriff's deputies and search team leaders discussing our case in training seminars and conference presentations, using it as an example of how wilderness disappearances can confound conventional search methodology. They study the timeline and evidence with professional detachment, analyzing decision points and resource allocation without understanding that behind every missing persons case is a family that learned to live around a hole shaped like the people they lost. I continued my work with the Geological Survey until my retirement in 2015, spending my final years creating maps that included notes about underground systems and unusual statistical clustering of missing persons cases. My reports were carefully neutral, documenting observations without drawing conclusions that might be challenged by colleagues who preferred explanations that fit within standard frameworks. But the information was there for future researchers who might develop better tools for understanding landscapes that resisted conventional interpretation. The cave system where we found Dad's equipment has been partially mapped by university teams using ground-penetrating radar and specialized photography equipment, but the chambers extend beyond the limits of current technology. Recent discoveries include evidence of underground waterways that connect to surface features hundreds of miles apart, natural transportation systems that could explain how objects move through underground spaces at speeds that suggest forces beyond simple water flow. But I remember the smell of my own retirement party, how the cake frosting and coffee scents mixed with the musty odor of government office buildings to create an atmosphere that reminded me of manila folders full of missing persons reports, documentation of unsolved mysteries that would outlive everyone who had worked on them. My colleagues offered congratulations and best wishes for retirement activities that would take me far from topographical charts and statistical anomalies, but they didn't understand that some work continues beyond formal employment. Now I spend my time organizing the documentation we accumulated over more than 30 years of investigation, creating an archive that might help future researchers who encounter similar patterns in other regions. The materials include not just official reports and evidence photographs, but also Mom's personal notes, her maps with color-coded theories, her correspondence with other families who had experienced unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. The archive reveals that our case wasn't isolated, that families across the American West have encountered similar patterns of disappearance that resist explanation through conventional search methodology. Children who vanish while their parents are momentarily distracted, experienced hikers who disappear from familiar trails under conditions that should have ensured their safety, families who follow established routes and never reach their intended destinations, leaving behind evidence that suggests they continued traveling beyond the point where any known trail could take them. To this day, I hear from relatives of other missing persons, people who find my contact information through internet searches and want to compare notes about cases that share certain characteristics with ours. They describe the same progression from normal family outing to inexplicable absence, the same discovery of personal items arranged in patterns that suggest intention rather than accident, the same sense that conventional search efforts are missing something fundamental about how these disappearances occur. Some families have organized private investigations that focus on underground systems and statistical clustering rather than traditional search patterns. They hire cave exploration specialists and geological consultants, people who understand that surface maps provide incomplete information about three-dimensional landscape features. These efforts have discovered additional cave chambers containing preserved personal items, arrangements that suggest ongoing processes rather than one-time events. But I remember the smell of their correspondence, how letters and emails from other affected families carry traces of the same desperate hope that Mom maintained for decades, the belief that understanding the mechanism of disappearance might somehow lead to recovery or reunion. They share photos of missing relatives and maps of search areas, creating informal networks of people who understand that some mysteries require resources and perspectives that official investigations don't provide. The most recent development occurred last summer, nearly 40 years after Dad and Emma disappeared. A cave exploration team working in Montana discovered a chamber that contained what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement of stones, organized in patterns that matched Emma's distinctive color coding system. The stones were accompanied by survey equipment that included compasses engraved with initials belonging to missing persons from multiple decades. The chamber was deeper than previous discoveries, accessible only through passages that required specialized technical climbing skills and equipment that wouldn't have been available to civilian hikers. Yet it contained evidence of human presence that spanned from the 1960s through recent years, suggesting ongoing processes that continue to transport people and objects through underground systems that extend far beyond currently mapped boundaries. Nobody wanted to talk about the implications of finding Emma's stone patterns in a chamber that couldn't be reached through conventional hiking or climbing, but the evidence was documented with the same forensic precision used in criminal investigations. The stones were photographed from multiple angles, measured and catalogued, tested for mineral content that might indicate their geographical origin. They matched the sample stones we had preserved from her collection, but they also included types that don't occur naturally in surface geology. The discovery has prompted new research into underground transportation systems that might explain how people and objects move through cave networks over distances that seem impossible without mechanical assistance. Recent theoretical work in geology suggests that certain underground waterways create pressure systems capable of transporting objects through spaces where human travel would normally be impossible, natural pneumatic tubes that operate according to principles we don't fully understand. Until today, I continue receiving updates from researchers who are mapping these underground systems, using technology that reveals chamber networks extending across multiple states, connected by waterways and air passages that form what might be described as a parallel transportation infrastructure operating beneath the mapped surface world. Their work suggests that disappearances in wilderness areas might be connected to natural processes that operate on geological timescales, but affect human events in ways we're only beginning to recognize. But I remember the smell of recent cave discoveries, how it matches the wrongness I detected in our cabin attic 40 years ago, the same sweet corruption that seemed to permeate underground chambers where personal items gather according to systems we can't decipher. It's as if the earth itself is collecting souvenirs from human encounters, preserving evidence of meetings between surface world and underground world that result in transportation to places our maps haven't measured. The research continues, expanding to include other regions where missing persons statistics reveal similar clustering patterns. Universities have established programs for studying what they carefully term unconventional landscape features, academic language for phenomena that don't fit into traditional geological or geographical frameworks. Grant funding supports cave exploration projects and underground mapping initiatives that might eventually provide explanations for processes that currently exist beyond the boundaries of scientific understanding. I participate in these research efforts as a consultant, sharing our family's documentation and contributing survey expertise to projects that might prevent other families from experiencing what mine endured. The work is slow and methodical, requiring techniques and equipment that didn't exist when Dad and Emma disappeared, but it represents the first systematic attempt to understand landscape features that conventional mapping methodology has overlooked. To this day, I hear Emma's voice saying, "Someone up there wants to play with me," whenever I read reports about new cave discoveries or underground chamber arrangements. Her 8-year-old certainty that something was calling to her from the cabin attic now seems like recognition of processes that extend far beyond a single building or weekend vacation. She may have been responding to something that operates throughout these landscapes, something that calls to people who are sensitive enough to hear voices that others dismiss as imagination or environmental noise. The most recent theory, proposed by researchers who specialize in underground acoustic phenomena, suggests that certain cave systems create resonance effects that can transmit sounds across vast distances through bedrock and underground waterways. These natural communication networks might explain reports of voices calling from underground sources, sounds that seem to originate from spaces no human has ever entered, but that carry familiar cadences that make listeners think of missing family members. But I remember the taste of that theory when I first read it, how it seemed to coat my mouth with something sweet and wrong, like scientific language trying to contain processes that resist containment through academic frameworks. The researchers mean well, and their work provides valuable documentation of underground systems that affect surface events, but they're studying phenomena that might be fundamentally different from what their methodology can measure or explain. As I write this account during the winter of 2024, 42 years have passed since our family vacation became a missing persons case that spawned decades of investigation, research, and speculation. I'm the only remaining witness to the progression from ordinary summer trip to statistical anomaly, the only person who remembers how normal everything seemed during our first few days at the cabin, before wrongness began seeping through the floorboards like groundwater rising through foundation cracks. The documentation I've maintained fills 3 filing cabinets and covers topics ranging from conventional search reports to speculative research about geological processes that might explain transportation of objects through underground systems over distances that seem impossible without mechanical assistance. Future investigators will have access to information that wasn't available during the original search efforts, tools and techniques that might reveal patterns we couldn't recognize using 1982 methodology and equipment. Nobody wants to talk about whether Dad and Emma are still alive somewhere in underground chambers that extend beyond mapped boundaries, preserved by the same processes that maintain personal items discovered by cave exploration teams. The evidence suggests transportation rather than death, movement from surface world to underground world through systems we're only beginning to understand. But transportation to where and for what purpose remains beyond current investigative capabilities. The smell follows me everywhere now, that sweet wrongness that permeated our cabin's attic and underground chambers where missing persons evidence accumulates according to systems we can't decipher. It clings to my clothes and hair the way smoke clings to fabric, a persistent reminder that some experiences create changes that can't be washed away or forgotten through deliberate effort. I carry the scent of deep places, underground spaces where time moves differently, and missing persons cases become something other than tragedy. Until today, I dream about reunion dinners, where Dad and Emma return with stories about underground kingdoms and transportation systems that connect cave networks across continental distances. In these dreams, they've been exploring regions that exist below our maps, documenting geographical features that operate according to principles we haven't discovered. They carry new maps that show 3-dimensional territories where surface elevation markers provide only partial information about navigable spaces. But the dreams always end with the sound of stones rattling in Emma's pocket, that distinctive rhythm that meant she was running toward adventure or away from something that required escape. The sound follows me into waking hours, creating moments where I turn to look for her bright yellow jacket among crowds of strangers, expecting to see her 8-year-old face beaming with excitement about discoveries she's made in places I'll never visit. The sound reminds me that some people don't disappear completely, that they continue existing in ways that resist detection through conventional search methodology, but leave traces detectable by family members who know their distinctive rhythms and patterns. Emma's stone rattling has become my proof that somewhere in underground chambers that extend beyond current mapping capabilities, she's still organizing her collection according to color systems that make sense only to her, still creating patterns that might guide others through territories that don't appear on surface world charts. And sometimes, during quiet moments when I'm alone with my surveying equipment in areas that remind me of our 1982 vacation spot, I think I hear Dad calling my name from depths that measurement can't reach, his voice carrying through underground acoustic systems that transmit sounds across distances measured in decades rather than miles. His call sounds like invitation rather than distress, as if he's discovered territories worth exploring, but accessible only through transportation methods that require leaving behind everything that connects us to surface world existence. The invitation echoes in my dreams and follows me through waking hours, a persistent suggestion that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved from outside, but understood through participation. Through accepting transportation to underground chambers, where missing persons cases become something other than loss. But I'm too old now for the kind of adventure that requires abandoning mapped territories, too attached to surface world routines that provide comfort even when they can't provide complete answers. So I maintain the archive and contribute to research efforts and wait for discoveries that might explain what happened to families who followed familiar trails into territories that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional geographical understanding. I carry their memory and preserve their documentation and hope that future investigators will develop tools capable of mapping three-dimensional landscape features that operate according to principles we're only beginning to recognize. But I remember the smell of deep places, and I know that some territories will always resist mapping because they exist in dimensions our current methodology can't measure. Dad and Emma are somewhere in those unmapped spaces, continuing their exploration of regions that don't appear on charts used by surface world cartographers, following routes that require different kinds of navigation equipment and courage I no longer possess. Their absence has taught me that love persists beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding, that family connections continue operating even when transportation systems carry members into territories that exist below the measured world. The smell of wrongness and sweetness that permeated our cabin and underground chambers isn't corruption, but preservation, the scent of spaces where missing persons transform into something other than statistical entries in law enforcement databases. Until today, I carry the sound of Emma's stones and the echo of Dad's voice calling from depths I'll never reach, reminders that some journeys continue beyond the point where surface world search efforts can follow. They're still exploring, still mapping territories that exist in dimensions parallel to our measured landscape, still creating patterns that might guide other families through transportation systems that operate according to principles we haven't discovered. And in my dreams, I sometimes glimpse the maps they're creating underground, charts that show three-dimensional territories where missing persons cases become geographic discoveries, where families separated by surface world events continue their adventures in chambers that extend beyond current mapping capabilities. These dream maps suggest that love itself creates navigation systems capable of operating across distances, measured in dimensions rather than miles, connections that persist even when conventional search methodology declares people permanently absent. The smell of deep places reminds me that absence isn't always loss, that transportation systems exist beyond our current understanding, that some families continue their journeys in territories that don't appear on charts used by surface world cartographers, but remain accessible through processes that operate according to different principles, deeper currents, underground rivers that carry more than water through chambers, where time moves according to geological rather than human measurements, where missing persons cases become something larger than tragedy, something closer to transformation, something that smells like sweetness and wrongness mixed together in proportions that create new categories of experience, new ways of understanding what it means for people to disappear from mapped territories and continue existing in spaces that measurement can't reach but memory can hold, preserving connection across distances that stretch beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding into regions where the rattle of stones in small pockets marks paths through unmapped territories, where families separated by surface world events discover that love creates its own geographic systems, its own navigation principles, its own maps that operate according to different rules in chambers that exist below the measured world. In depths where the scent of preservation mingles with echoes of voices calling across distances that can't be calculated using surface world measurement systems, but remain navigable through processes that connect families across territories that exist in dimensions our current cartography hasn't learned to map.